Good morning, this is Jen, and this is video 3 of the Federal Jurisdiction Report, Jurisdiction over Federal Areas Within the States. I'm continuing in Chapter 1, and I want to read to you just a couple of parts of this report. This is the first report put out in 1956. Let's see, it says the federal government is being required to furnish to areas within the states over which it has jurisdiction in various forms, governmental services and facilities which its structure is not designed to supply efficiently or economically. So it's saying here that the federal government, which is called the United States, is being required to furnish some places in the United States over which the federal government has authority in a variety of forms. We talked about those. Those are the jurisdictional codes, the jurisdictions: exclusive, concurrent, partial, proprietorial, and unknown. And it has these jurisdictions to supply for services to the military places, the military to itself, which a structure is not designed to supply efficiently or economically. So those services are not in the Constitution. They're unconstitutional, and that's why they started creating instrumentalities, which are corporations, and they started putting corporations in the states, which eventually expanded themselves and encompassed all the people of the state and not just the federal people of the state. The relationship between states and persons residing in federal areas in those states is disarranged and disrupted, with tax losses, loss of police control, and other disadvantages to the states. Now, remember, there's two states. There's an independent state and there's a dependent state. The dependent states are the military areas inside the independent states. So Texas would be the independent state, and the state of Texas would be the dependent state. Many residents of federally owned areas are deprived of numerous privileges and services, such as voting. Okay, so many residents of federally owned areas are deprived of numerous privileges and services, such as voting and certain access to courts. Now, it's talking about the state stuff, not the federal stuff. So it's talking about the federal people on the federal lands are deprived of access to state voting and state courts, which are usual incidents of residence within a state. In short, it was found by the Department of Justice that this whole important field of federal-state relations was in a confused and chaotic state, and that more was needed than a solution of the school problem at hand. So the school issue was not just the only issue, because remember during part 1 we talked about how the military officers on the post who had their families there with them, they were complaining that they didn't have a place for their kids to go to school. They didn't have a place for their wives to go to have their babies. They didn't have hospitals or schools. They didn't have insane asylums, fire departments, police departments, and all those things. So all these services that were instituted in the states by the federal government was supposed to be services provided to the federal people, because the people of the states didn't really give two shits about the people on the federal lands. They just told them, you know what, you wanted to be over there and you wanted to get paid for doing that job, then you figure out your own shit. There was needed a thorough study of the entire subject of legislative jurisdiction. Okay, so that's the authority for Congress, federal Congress, to make laws. Okay, who do they make laws for? Well, in the Constitution it says they make laws for only the people and the lands to which the states gave up for federal purposes, which the federal government had to purchase, with a view towards resolving as many possible of the problems which lack of full knowledge and understanding of the subject had bred. So it was saying that for many years nobody really understood what the Constitution said or meant, and so they've had to sort of figure it out. Okay, the Constitution is vague. It's like leaving your ranch with the gate wide open. Anything can come in and anything can go out, and anybody can interpret anything to mean anything at once. So because the Constitution's vague, or appears to be vague, there's no way to really know exactly what it means. So they've done all this studying to figure it out. And so once they figured they had it figured out, they wrote these reports. And these reports are in 1956 and 1957 during the Eisenhower administration. These reports you can find online. The Attorney General so recommended to the President and the Cabinet, and with their approval and support, the instant study resulted. The preface to this report identifies the agencies, state and federal, which most actively participated in the study. Subsequent portions of the report set out in some detail the results of the study. The committee desires to outline at this point, so as to furnish assistance for evaluation of its report, the manner in which the study was conducted, the manner in which the committee's report is being presented, and some of the problems involved. The land area of the United States is 1.9 billion acres. It was ascertained from available sources that of this area of federal government as of a recent date owned 405 million acres. So it says the land area of the United States. Really, it should say the land area of the United States of America is 1.9 billion acres. And that the federal government, being the United States, owned 405 million acres, or more than 21% of the continental United States. Okay. It owns more than 87% of the land in the state of Nevada, over 50% of the land in several other states, and considerable land in every state of the Union. The Department of the Interior controls lands having a total greater area than that of the 6 New England states and Texas combined. The Department of Agriculture controls more than 3/4 as much land as the Department of Interior. Altogether, 23 agencies of the federal government control property owned by the United States outside the District of Columbia. Any survey relating to these lands is therefore bound to constitute a considerable project. Okay, so what I want to look at after this is the inventory report. Okay, so how did it find out that it owned all these lands other than it was supposed to keep track in the first place? And that is from this study. And this study mentions the jurisdiction report. Okay, so the inventory is done because this report came out. So the jurisdiction over federal areas within the state came out, and then they did this report. Now, what I'm trying to help people understand is that the federal officers and employees who became citizens of the United States by application through the state court became federal citizens, and they were residents of federal lands. Okay, so because this report came out and they realized maybe they were applying the Constitution wrong, they had to take an inventory of all the federal areas, and they had to document what jurisdiction each of those federal areas had, because the federal government was only given the right to make laws without interference from the state on the federal lands that were used for defense purposes, and that was really the only purpose they were given, to purchase lands and for defense. So that was exclusive legislative jurisdiction. Now they've created all of these other jurisdictions on all these other lands so that it could implement services that were desired by the people on the federal lands, like the hospitals, insane asylums, police departments. All these things were done to try to build up the defenses. Okay, so and provide services to the people on those lands. Okay, so those federal citizens on the federal lands needed services, and so they started instituting banks. But banks weren't part of defense. It wasn't part of the Constitution. It wasn't necessary for defense purposes. It was only necessary to provide a service to the people on the federal lands. So let's say the schools, which were a big issue, the mothers needed a place to send, mothers and fathers needed a place to send their kids to school, so they have to bus them off the military lands, off the military posts, the reservations, off the federal property. But in order to do that, they had to have a contract between, like, let's say Texas, the independent state, and the federal government. And what they did was they created like a new state. So that would be state of Texas, which is the administration of these service contracts. But since then, when Lincoln took over the whole independent state, and he did a lot of things outside of his jurisdiction, outside of the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which he wasn't allowed to do, which really makes them null and void. He took over the independent states and expanded the jurisdiction of the federal government, encompassing basically everyone. And I think it had started long before that, like could be back as early as 1835 or 1836, but I'll have to get more information on that before I talk about it in depth. But here in this inventory report, what it's saying here is that in 1962, when this report came out, this is printed in 1964, but the report is from 1962. So this report came out, and then I guess it wasn't signed until 1964 by Bernard Bolton, the administrator, and he's talking to the president in the White House. He says, General Services Administration has completed the second comprehensive inventory of the jurisdictional status of federal areas within the states. The compilation of this inventory reflects the interest which GSA, together with the Bureau of Budget and the Department of Justice, because the reason why the Department of Justice is involved is because they can't actually charge anyone with a federal crime who didn't commit the crime on federal lands. They can only summons people to come back to the federal lands to stand in a federal court for federal crimes. So the Department of Justice needs to know all these jurisdictions so that it can know whether or not it's applying the laws correctly. But the thing is once they expanded the corporations inside the states, the corporations now have taken over or made themselves appear to be governments, from the way I understand it right now, and just kind of grabbed people like prize law. They have, in the progress being made by all federal agencies in adjusting the legislative status of their properties. Okay, so like banks, the land that a bank sits on, like a Federal Reserve Bank, is actually called a city. School districts are called small jurisdictions. Small jurisdictions are called small businesses. They don't have the same, the federal government doesn't have the same legislative or lawmaking power over those areas because they're not used for defense purposes. They were only given complete power over the areas used for defense. Okay, so it's involving all these different agencies or bureaus or whatever you have, whatever you call them, so that they can put all this information together and see what they're doing wrong and what they need to do to change things to make them right. So they took an inventory of all the lands, and which is enclosed herewith, directly complements the inventory report on real property owned by the United States throughout the world. So you have continental United States being on the continent. You have overseas continental, all the lands that the federal government owns overseas. So you have CONUS and OCONUS. CONUS being continental United States and OCONUS mean overseas continental United States. Overseas government having interest or jurisdiction over some lands overseas. So the inventory will be made available to federal agencies and state governments. So, okay, so they know, they're aware of jurisdiction. They know that they don't have jurisdiction over people not part of their government. So what do? Issued a birth certificate, made you a legal person, gave you a social security number, a driver's license where you have to admit or claim to be a citizen of the United States, which are actually federal people on federal lands, not private people off of federal lands where they have no jurisdiction. So in order to reach out and grab you and bring you in under their authority, they allow you to claim to be one of them and pay taxes and get licenses and all these other things. The solution of jurisdictional status problems and the development of appropriate remedial legislation, S 815 and HR 4433, pending before Congress, would facilitate the adjustment of legislative jurisdiction over federal areas within the states. Okay, so here I'd like to bring up, I've been doing some searches, but the search is not necessarily what I want to show you here. I want to show you Title 5. Title 5 is where they talk about employees of the federal government, officers and employees of the federal government, government organization, and employees. Okay, so you can see here flags, seal, seat of government in the states. I think it's actually, let's look real quick. It shows who pays taxes. Taxpayers, people who pay an income tax, are people who receive compensation, the states, income tax, sales tax, all this stuff, are for the people of the state, which is not, according to their own documents, all the people, but the people in their federal area, within a federal area. Okay, they have to pay state taxes. That made the federal citizens also state citizens, but it did not make state citizens federal citizens. But they allow you to claim that so that they can tax you. They can say, well, we didn't know. You know, you wanted to pay. You obviously did. 1939 code also allows people to, also the 1939 IRC, which is the Internal Revenue Code, shows that on its face that income tax, people who paid income tax were federal officers and employees of the federal government receiving compensation for their services. Okay, so here's the contents: jurisdictional status of federal land areas by states, jurisdictional status of federal land areas in the United States by agency and bureau, such and such, on and on. Nowhere in this report does it say that the federal government has jurisdiction over America or Americans. Okay, so you can go through here, and this is probably the most important thing you'll ever see in your entire life, where you can give this or take this to court with you, or at least I would, and ask them, because you can ask them to prove that they have jurisdiction, that they have power and authority over you, and just say, just tell me which one of these codes you're under, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I need to know your jurisdictional code. Okay, and if they say, well, we're not federal, we're state, well, you said you're state of, and the state of is a legal creation of the federal government to supply services to the people of the federal lands. So still you're under one of these codes, because state of Texas or state of Oklahoma, state of Maine, state of Maryland are all federal legal states.